What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. A little while back, I reviewed a couple of books by the late Ben Bova, Orion and King Arthur, and then Orion Among the Stars. Those are the last two books in his Orion series. I read Orion and King Arthur first because that was the only one that my library had, and I was reading it to see what Ben Bova's take on King Arthur is, because I am a big King Arthur fan, and I really didn't know that much about the Orion series. I had heard a little bit about it before reading that book, but mostly I was reading it as a King Arthur fan. And then I liked that book, and then I found Orion Among the Stars super cheap on eBay and got it and read it. Didn't even realize that was the second to last book in the series, and I liked it okay. And then I think it was in that video where I said I had kind of picked up on the formula that Ben Bova was using with this character and with this series, and I think I said I wouldn't really have to read any more of the books in the series. And then I accidentally stumbled upon all of the rest of the books in the series out in the wild pretty cheap, and so I went ahead and bought all the books in the series. So now the only one I don't have is Orion and King Arthur, and then I read the first Orion book, didn't do a video on it because I didn't really think I had a whole lot to talk about there, and then I read the next book in the series, Vengeance of Orion, and I want to amend what I seem to recall saying in my video on Orion Among the Stars. Yes, there is a formula that Ben Bova is utilizing with this series. And number one, something being formulaic is not necessarily a bad thing. If you are a writer and you are creating stories in a serialized form, it may be comic books, or it may be a TV show, or a series of movies, or a series of books, having a formula can help you. You just have to come up with ideas, and using the formula can help you do that. And I think maybe, I'm not really sure what was putting me off on wanting to read the other books in the series when I read Orion Among the Stars, but the idea of Orion, if you haven't read any of these books and you haven't watched my other videos on these other books, basically Orion is a test tube baby created like thousands and thousands of years in the future, and by that point humanity has evolved so that they basically resemble gods, and they need to time travel and poke around in the past to preserve the future the way they want it to be preserved. And it's kind of that Arthur C. Clarke thing of any technology indistinguishable from magic, that whole thing. And so you've got these human beings with crazy abilities and technological prowess, and then they are going to different points in time and presenting themselves as gods so that they can change the past to have the desired effect that they want. And then Orion was created by one of them, who is basically Apollo. He goes by different names depending on what period of time Orion is in, but he's basically Apollo, and Orion does not like Apollo. Apollo is not a likable character, but also you understand why Apollo is doing what he's doing. And the reason that I am talking about Vengeance of Orion when I didn't do a video on the first Orion book, which was just called Orion, is that even though this book is following the formula of Orion is dropped off at a period of time, and then he has to do something to change history so that it matches what we know, or he's trying to prevent something from happening, even though this does follow the formula, what I realized reading Vengeance of Orion is that the formula, yes, you know there's a formula, but what is interesting reading these early stories that I didn't pick up on when reading Orion Among the Stars, because that one is set in the far future and is not set in a historical time period, when reading these, you pretty quickly figure out, oh, okay, this is, like, this one is divided up into three sections, and the first section is the Trojan War, and a lot of people are going to be familiar with the Trojan War, but what's interesting about this is that it takes twists and turns that you don't necessarily see coming. When you open up the book, and, like, one of the first things it says is, Book 1, Troy, and you're like, oh, okay, Trojan War, but then at one point, Agamemnon and Odysseus and a lot of the higher-ups on the Achaean side of the Trojan War, they are willing to form a sort of truce with the city of Troy. And then Orion, he is kind of promoted himself. He's working for Odysseus at this point. He is a messenger, and because Apollo does not want... I think Apollo wants the war to end. Orion is like, well, I don't want the war to end because Apollo is responsible for the love of my life dying, and so I am going to make sure that this war keeps going. And so Orion is a messenger, a go-between between Troy and the invading Achaeans, and so he changes the message to make sure that the war keeps going. And reading this, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Orion is not a good guy here. He's kind of a jerk, and a lot of people die because Orion wanted to stick it to Apollo. And this follows the formula of Orion is dropped off in a period of time and has to do something that the gods want him to do, but then it also kind of fights against the formula, which is interesting because this is only the second book in the series. Now, the first book was actually a collection of shorter stories that had been published in a magazine and then was later collected as a book, but if you're just looking at the reprinted books, this is only the second one in the series. But this also kind of surprised me because in the first book, there's like 4 stories, and spoilers for the first Orion book, at the end of each one, he dies, and then he's resurrected in another time and place. And with that one also, like, he will be in, I believe, Mongolia at one point, and he's kind of close to, I think it's Genghis Khan's grandson, and he doesn't know what his mission is. And then when you finally do find out his mission, you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And so with this one, I was expecting something similar. I was expecting, because I'm pretty sure at the beginning it says, like, Book 1, Troy, Book 2, Jericho. Okay, it doesn't say that at the beginning. Yeah, so Book 1, it says Troy, but then somewhere I may have kind of peeked ahead, but it's Book 2, or Book 1, Troy, Book 2, Jericho, Book 3, Egypt. And I was expecting, okay, he's going to die somehow in the Trojan War, and then he's going to be dropped into Jericho, which is a story in the Old Testament in the book of Joshua. And then he'll die again, and then he'll be dropped somewhere in ancient Egypt. But he doesn't do that. Ben Bova, places all of these stories around the same time period. So basically, Helen of Troy, after Orion rescues her and brings her back to her husband Menelaus, she's like, I don't really want to go back to Sparta. Even the Queen of Sparta is basically treated like a dog. I don't really want to go back there. That's kind of why I liked it here in Troy. And then because one of Orion's friends was talking smack about Agamemnon, the High King of the Achaeans, and then he gets blinded, Orion is kind of upset about that, so he says, okay, yeah, I'll take Helen, and basically I'm going to kidnap her, and then we're going to try to get to Egypt where she will be protected, and then she won't have to be with her jerk of a husband. And so then they're on foot, Orion, Helen, and a few Hittites that joined the war and were working for Orion, and then they basically just accidentally happen upon the traveling Israelites from the Old Testament. And this is where the book kind of loses me a little bit. Now, I am a Christian, I read the Bible, and so maybe part of it is that this portion of the book where it really portrays the Israelites in kind of an awful light, maybe that was why this portion of the book didn't really work for me. But also, when you look at other adventures that Orion goes on, it feels like Ben Bova tries really hard to work in all of this stuff that we know about that time period and make it work with the Orion mythos. For example, the Trojan War, Orion's friends who are Hittites, they're the ones who suggest a siege engine. And then they're going to, it's just basically a really big wooden tower that they can roll up to the wall of Troy, and then it's going to be covered in wet horsehide so that they can't burn the engine while they're climbing and then coming into the city. And then that is where the legend of the Trojan horse comes from, because as they're climbing, some kid inside says, look, it's a giant horse. And then the legends evolve into they had a big wooden horse that they rolled up, and that's how they got in the city. And I find that interesting. I've talked before about how some authors will demythify mythological stories, and Bim Bova is doing that, but he's also including these really weird sci-fi concepts like time travel and reincarnation and gods who are actually highly evolved humans, but then he's demythifying other things like the Trojan War is basically just a regular war. And then in Orion and King Arthur, the Lady of the Lake is basically just a woman from the future who is pretending like she's like a fairy woman giving a magic sword to Arthur. And so I found it interesting that Bim Bova was able to, in this, not only in this, but also like in Orion and King Arthur, take the things that you know from the Trojan War and King Arthur, but then recontextualize them to fit within the narrative that he had already created with Orion. And then you get to the Israelites, and it just really feels like Bim Bova just wanted to slap around Christianity and Judaism and just say, haha, these guys are idiots, this story is really stupid. And it doesn't really bear much resemblance to the story of the fall of Jericho from the Old Testament. In this story, Orion, or somebody, comes up with the idea of digging under the city of Jericho and then basically planting period-appropriate bombs under the walls of Jericho so that they can bring down the walls and go inside. Because in the Old Testament, in the book of Joshua, the children of Israel, they walk around the city several times, I can't remember how many times, and then they're blowing trumpets, and then God brings the walls down. And then in this story, Apollo slash Aten slash all the different Ormazd, all the different names that he's gone by, he is the one, he wants Orion to bring down the walls, and he is the God of the Old Testament to Joshua and the traveling Israelites. It doesn't really, I don't remember if it explains why Apollo wants the walls to come down, but basically Orion at this point says, okay, I will do it, because at this point Apollo says, if you do it, your lover, I can try to bring her back to life. And so Orion at this point is perfectly willing to work with Apollo, and Joshua is just a complete jerk in this, and when you read the Old Testament, Joshua doesn't really come off as having much of a personality. We don't know much about Joshua other than he was the leader of the children of Israel, but here he basically kidnaps Orion and says, you're coming with us and you're going to help us take out all of our enemies, and it just doesn't really bear very much resemblance to the fall of Jericho. In the Old Testament, there is a prostitute named Rahab who helps them, who helps some of the spies who come into the city, and without her help, those spies would have died. And then she is kind of spared, her and her family, from the fall of Jericho. This story doesn't mention Rahab or her family. And it's weird that Bim Bova is able to make all of the ins and outs of the Trojan War fit into his narrative with Orion and the mythos of the gods in the Orion stories. He's able to make all of the Trojan War stuff fit with his story that he had already kind of constructed, and then it just seems like he said, well, some scholars say that the fall of Jericho would have happened right around the same time as the Trojan War, so I guess I'll just quickly throw in the fall of Jericho here, and then he doesn't really try to make all of the elements from the fall of Jericho from the Old Testament fit in with what he's doing. I would have liked to have seen him try to work in Rahab, try to somehow make that work, and maybe try to find a way to make the story as it's presented in the book of Joshua fit with what he's doing here in Vengeance of Orion. And I probably would have even been okay with Joshua being presented as kind of a jerk if this story that we have here resembled the fall of Jericho that we have in the Old Testament a little bit more. But then that is the shortest of the three books in this book here. And then after that, Orion, Helen, and his Hittite friends, they make it to Egypt, and then I feel like the book is a little stronger at that point, because then it's like it remembers, oh yeah, Menelaus is trying to find his wife Helen, who has gone missing again, and then it connects a lot of the threads that were introduced in the first part, in Troy. It connects to a lot of that. So in my opinion, the first part, the Trojan War, and then the third part where they're at Egypt, and then it's kind of connecting with some stuff that happened in the first Orion book, and then it's saying like, okay, some of these Egyptian gods are actually these gods that Orion knows and has been speaking with. I feel like the third part is a lot stronger than the middle portion. And again, I feel like Bim Bova he is probably a pretty big fan of, was a pretty big fan of history, more so than I am, and so he had heard, oh, okay, scholars think that Jericho fell around the same time as Troy, give or take a few years, and so he wanted to try and work that in, but I feel like his heart wasn't really into it. I feel like he didn't really do the research on this story like he did with the Trojan War and with a lot of the stuff going on in Egypt, in my opinion. I did like this book. I know it sounds like I'm really down on it. It was really just the middle part, which isn't really that long, that didn't really work for me. But the beginning part I thought was great. I love it. One of my favorite adaptations of the Trojan War. And then the third part in Egypt, I also like that quite a bit too. Then the book ends with a stinger that's kind of setting up the next Orion book, and I have that one, so I am interested in reading it. I don't know if I'll do a video on it, but I did want to amend what I said. I know this video's been all over the place, but I did want to kind of redact what I said in my video on Orion Among the Stars, where I said, oh, this series is very formulaic. Orion is dropped off in a point in time. The gods want to do something. Orion sometimes will help them. Sometimes he kind of resists. Yes, that is happening, but sometimes having a formula can help you in coming up with more stories. And if you have ever tried to come up with your own stories, you realize that can be very beneficial. And then also, sometimes it will use the formula, but then it will take twists and turns that you don't necessarily expect. And this book does that in spades. And I don't want to ruin any of the twists in this book, any of the other twists that I haven't already ruined. But yeah, I more or less enjoyed this. And I am enjoying reading these books. I know I had said I probably wasn't going to, and then I stumbled upon most of these books in bookstores, and then I ended up buying all of them that I didn't have except for Orion and King Arthur. So that is about all that I have to say, my scattershot feelings on Vengeance of Orion. Hope you guys like this video, and I will be back in the future with more videos. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.